Welcome to Public Comment. I'm John Dunbar, former mayor of Yountville.
And I'm Alfredo Pedroza, farmer.
I'm Rob Eyler, professor of economics at Sonoma State University.
Thanks for joining us as we talk about politics, people, finances, and whatever else is on our mind.
Go Seawolves. Now, at what point do you want to do something about it versus just bitch to the elected?
Your core wine audience is starting to fade
because
out.
The industry cannot survive the same way it did 50 years
Isn't
ago.
that a huge threat to agriculture?
Then maybe it's time to walk.
You guys are making me thirsty.
Well, you have to keep drinking, Don, but
Thank you for joining us today. I know, Alfredo, you go way back to your Seawolf days,
absolutely.
but I don't know if there are any stories that either you or Rob want to share with us today about your early years and your formative years.
It was great, John. I should have listened to my professors. I should have stayed in business. I'm not sure why I ventured into politics, John. So,
And ag farming. So you've really gone off the rails.
are you saying I should go teach a class about farming, John? Is that what
No,
you're
I
implying
really
here?
shouldn't. So anyway, Rob, good to see you. It's unfortunately, you probably have no sleep and you're constantly busy talking about the wine industry and the economics and the challenging economics of the wine industry. But before we get into all that, we like to hear a little bit of the personal background, kind of what you got, what got you here to this point. And, you've been over in Sonoma at Sonoma State and throughout the region for a long, long time. So just a quick background of your career.
No, totally. Thank you. So I started at Sonoma State in 1995. I grew up in Santa Rosa. My family are sheep and cattle ranchers from West Sonoma and West Marin counties.
No way.
Yeah. And so I kind of grew up in a very indirect farming way in the sense that I was a weekend farmer and a very light one at that. But when I was a child, I, would go out there and that would be one way I'd earn money, and it sort of, connected me to family. They still actually operate those two ranches that are in the town of Bodega and the town of Valley Forge. So that's something that I've had a little exposure to farming, but then I decided to do something totally different. I went to school at CSU Chico and then to UC Davis and ended up back teaching at Sonoma State. And then I was married at the time to someone who was a general manager of a winery and got really, enamored with the industry in kind of three ways. And one, how complex it really is and how amazing this region is in terms of what you can think of as integrating the supply chain from basically dirt to glass. The natural kind of microeconomics of, if you walk into a grocery store, how much of it is committed to wine, most, at least in the sense of thinking an entire row to innumerable brands. And then the third was just the sort of lifestyle piece of it and, just kind of getting into it as I aged. And then I got really lucky to be able to do some consulting projects. And before I knew it, I was somewhat in demand, which has been humbling and amazing over the last 20 something years.
So how have you been able to kind of balance, and also what are the similarities and differences in your academic role as well as in your professional role? Obviously they're related and connected, but do you have to kind of change your mindset, or is it really integrated well?
It's integrated in the sense that it all boils down to the sort of core economic thinking about the situation. So I'll give you two examples. One is when I kind of got started in doing the consulting side, there was a case out of Virginia where there was a lawsuit that a Virginia winery wanted to be able to distribute more broadly in the United States. And this is one of the original cases that went to the Supreme Court in the early 2000s and trying to break down barriers between reciprocal states and kind of what you can think of as sort of classic liquor board, if you want to say it
That's
that way.
still going
states.
on today.
Oh, no, 100%. So it hasn't quite gone all the way. But the argument that the lawyers wanted to make was one that was an international economics argument in the sense that you think about it almost like if you have 50 states that have each of their own laws, it's very similar to having 50 countries that are in kind of a weird trade union, to where if I go one direction, it has a certain rule book, you go the other direction, has another rule book, and how does the sort of international style interplay take place in such a way that you can interpret why this is actually problematic for, at least in a broad sense economically, you can call social welfare, and this one is better, and this is why we should go this way, analogous to kind of how we have reciprocal states, where California is one of those, in that subgroup.
It sounds like this might also be a constitutional issue, which is also starting to really percolate more and more. So it's not just about the ability to sell your product across state lines, basically, or internationally. We certainly have heard a lot about tariffs related to that, but the fact that some regulations are applied to certain types of wineries and distributors, different set of rules depending on when you started, where you are. So there is that question about, is it fair and equitable? There are some that say yes and some that say no.
And that the federalism of it is also very intriguing to think about how much, because the entire case that we were doing was basically a constitutional argument at that time also. And it's amazing how it's still kind of stringing out today. It hasn't quite completely solved itself, but that sort of strangle grip that either the distribution networks have or the states have legally based on the sort of federalist idea of having those state rights has been very intriguing to watch over the last couple of decades unfold.
Let's go a little bit more micro though, John, because, Rob, some of the things I hear, right, whether true or not, and I'd love your take on it, right, is Napa's getting more expensive, right? And I think we're blessed to have a vibrant wine economy, vibrant tourism economy that includes hospitality and food. And I don't know if that was intentional, but it just happened. Let's just say it happened to Napa. Now, what I hear often though is that when someone comes to Napa, their consumption power is being consumed by the cost of lodging, which lessens their ability to spend on wine. Now, sometimes that just seems like it's finger pointing, right? But what's your take from a global perspective of what you see in trends and then drilling it down to like what's going on in Napa right now? Because hotels say, hey, we're doing great. Our RevPAR, whatever they call it, is doing phenomenal. They lowered their FTE, which is smart. So they're making money maybe, but then the wineries are pissed off. And sometimes it's opposite. So like, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so my take specific to Napa, because Sonoma County has a similar but much more sort of diverse situation in terms of where the centerpieces are and with how the wine industry on the more agricultural side intersects with the tourism side. And Napa, it's a lot more integrated because of 29 being, in essence, that artery. The intriguing part to me is over the last 20 years, we've had a couple of severe downturns, and each one of those downturns have kind of had some lagged effect where there's been some shift in the industry, plus whatever sort of roller coastering would take place naturally in the industry. It seems like what happened this time, and now it's starting to play out where Napa's kind of a centerpiece of that, is you've got wineries making adjustments based on what they see as sort of a function of the post-COVID hangover, long-term viewpoint in terms of how consumption is going to continue, demographically, some of the changes that are happening where even if you kept on, your core wine audience is starting to fade out somewhat naturally, which is kind of maybe euphemistic.
Fade
way
out
of
is
saying
one
it.
way to put it. Yes.
But Napa has done an amazing job in the last 20 years of doing kind of micro diversification where they've looked at the wine tourist and kind of segmented and broken into pieces where there's the hotel experience, there's the food experience, and then there's the wine experience. And how much the wine experience is really driven by the agricultural and the manufacturing piece of the industry, and more by, I drive onto the gravel road, I hear the light jazz when I walk up the steps, I go into the tasting room, I smell the barrels and I smell the juice, and then I leave, get back and go right back to where I came. How much that is a function of the size of the agriculture and the manufacturing element is maybe one of the existential questions that Napa is going to have to ask. Sonoma's going to have to do the same thing. Now, the second part of your question is about the sort of price points and sort of trading the economics around in the valley. That is something that if you look at sort of up valley, where Calistoga and St. Helena have a little bit more of a lean toward the agriculture and manufacturing piece as a core of their economies versus the city of Napa, there's, it's a very strong dichotomy about how exposed each one of those sections of Napa are to the risk.
Well, look, and I agree with you.
But you guys are making me thirsty.
Well, you have to keep drinking, John. But when I hear friends that are on the road, and vintner friends that are on the road, and my response is like, what's the reception there? We're selling wine. I'm like, so the demand is still there. The consumption is there. We can talk about who's drinking at a separate time, but I said they're still drinking our wine. So that's positive. I said, but what's happening that you're having to go to them? And part of it is like, hey, it is a little bit more pricey, whether true or not, or perception. But I think there's also, people got a little fat and happy where they expected everyone to come here. And I'm like, well, what were you doing before? We were going on the road. I said, well, you were feeding the machine, which trickled into tourism and visitation. Right. So I think there was a little bit of that. Right. But that's why I was curious around your response. Now, when you say manufacturing, are you talking about the production of wine?
Yeah. Think of boxed wine, like classic bottled wine. Yeah.
So, but we talked about this, John. So in Napa County, we require for your winery, 60% of your footprint to be production. And it's dead space, right? Because what people are selling is the hospitality component, right? And those are some of the things I think Napa's going to have to grapple with. Of you can't ask people to go make an investment of millions of dollars to make wine out in the valley in the ag preserve when they can go do that at a custom crush facility much cheaper,
Totally.
right? And that's what I'm curious about from a policy and vision perspective. I don't know if Napa has had that next vision component of what it's going to be, right? Because I know enough because I was in banking before where the economics are hard, right? To make ag pencil, it is hard, right? So that's just what I've been seeing.
Well, and I think to your point, when you look at how often you use that 60%, where, we all know you see a crush pad, it's empty. It's used for parking typically for a lot of the time of the year until they're crushing. And there are other areas where you walk into a tank room and tanks are all there, but they're all empty, or the barrel room is empty. So it isn't the most efficient use of that space. And those that can do custom crush so they maximize the uses by other clients at least help kind of stretch that a little bit. But then you have the issues of traffic and some of the other negative consequences that people get so frustrated about, especially out in the more agricultural areas.
Well, we've talked about this, right? So you have growers, right? And then you have the vintners, right? Those that own wineries. And then you have a little bit of both, right? But I think the pressure points that everyone's facing are different though, Rob. And I'd love your take on those that are growers, right? The cost of doing business has changed, right? Now, how does that work? Because someone farming in Napa is probably paying the same labor costs than someone farming in Sonoma, maybe plus or minus. So what's your take on the cost of doing business though for agriculture? Do you think that's going to get some type of reform at some point?
No, I think, like any other smallish business, you're going to face these pressure points in a regressive way. If you see the cost of energy go up, where you can think of gasoline as just one vector in that space, the cost, wages rising, whether they be from legislation or they be from just supply and demand and a shift in the available workers that are there for ag. And that's also true within the winery itself. When you think about what happens when you start bottling wine, to the point you guys made earlier, you might see a little bit more of a diversification in the way that you use space, because you'll see some reduction in the investments and then maybe some doubling down in cases where you have the economics are a little bit better, to start saying, well, we can just now start taking in crush clients, and we might be able to use the space a little bit more completely, and depending on where you are. So, and again, when you go up valley, there's a little bit more, depending on how you think about AVAs and the labeling and the way you need to be very careful about the fruit you use to maintain that niche, how widespread you can get in those lines. But it's very different. You could look at three ranches. You could look at three parcels next door to each other, and they all three have different economic situations, because one will be tech money that really doesn't care about the gains and the losses. They just want it there. You'll have another one that might be a farming family that has slowly seen a devolution of the economics within their family over time. And one that might be more of a mix, dead in the middle, where they're all three going to make different decisions with basically the same economics.
Well, let me ask you a question.
On a more like on an annual basis.
Yeah.
Right. But here, I agree with you, right? There's money out there that doesn't need to make money.
Correct.
And we've seen that. And some of those families are selling now in Napa. But if it doesn't make money, isn't that fundamentally flawed? Right? Because that's my struggle. And because you have those that are growers that have a low basis. So, maybe they don't have any debt. So it's different. They can withstand a downturn. Then you have those in the middle that are new, that are banking on appreciation, making money. Then you have those that just are crazy and buying 30,000 a ton of grapes and using Monarch tractors because it's cool and it's symbolism, virtual signaling.
Even though they went back.
Yeah. But it's all that. And they're upside down. But fundamentally though, big picture, if you have enough people that are not making money, isn't that a huge threat to agriculture?
Oh, it sort of writ large and fundamentally, sure. Especially if you think it's driven by smaller farmers, absolutely. So it kind of depends on whether or not farmers feel like there's a stable enough foundation underneath them to kind of ride out this storm. Which
Napa historically has had.
Correct. Yeah. And Napa maybe I shouldn't say much, but to a certain extent, differently than places like Sonoma, San Luis Obispo, Fresno, Monterey,
Rhode Island,
as the case may be. just different places that have some exposure to the risk, but are maybe either more diversified in other ag, and thus there's sort of a general flow of ag that's different than, let's say, the Valley here. And also you have people that are in the wine industry for broader family farming, longer term, sort of land-based rather than money-based. But your fundamental comment is correct in the sense that at some point, I think even if you go 10 years with losing money, you might say, listen, we're not going to look at it from an income standpoint. We look from a wealth standpoint. We're losing money, so why keep pile driving money in? Let's take the money off the table. Let's take the appreciation, mitigate losses and get out. Now, if a lot of people do that simultaneously, that's where problems can start, right? It's like any other asset market that gets sort of divested from at a very quick rate. If it centers itself on a certain type of asset class, a lot of those assets could follow in almost like a mass hysteria within that market. That's kind of like the real nasty scenario.
Yeah.
But as long as the demand is there for Napa, I think that it's unlikely that would happen here. That's the tricky part, right? Is that, if the 200 acres went live, up Valley, would they stay on market that long? And would it really matter in the grand scheme in terms of the value? Probably not.
But we're already hearing from the county that assessments are being reduced.
Mm-hmm.
And some of that is because property that's zoned certain ways is being denied the ability to do those permitted uses,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's planting vineyards or making any modifications to production or business activity that does have a permit. So that's a challenge. I'm curious your take on the information that has been released through the Cal Poly report on the cost of agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
That the Napa County Farm Bureau was directly involved with getting that reporting done to actually put dollars next to crops and the cost of all that, and the fact that it's more expensive here than other places doing similar or the identical work. And what is the role of regulation having
Mm-hmm.
in that difference of cost? So what are your thoughts on that economic dynamic going on with regulation? Because I think we could say Napa is the most regulated wine region in California, if not the country, if not beyond. And does it have that significant an impact where other areas that are doing similar farming and agriculture don't have those same? Some of them are state regulations,
Mm-hmm.
some are federal,
Mm-hmm. Some of them are local.
but some are local.
Yeah, and I think there's been a lot of theater over the last 20 years, right, in the county about how to really support the wine industry, but also have this, sort of residential theater around, what should we allow to have happen. It's been very intriguing to watch because from an owner standpoint, you really want to have the flexibility, especially if you have an economic opportunity and you have the space. If the neighbors, it's been wild to watch. And that's also, it seems like Up Valley and versus Down Valley have kind of a different dynamic because of that too. So it's very tough to say that it should just be kind of, laissez-faire in the sense of just letting everybody kind of do what they want once they have on their own property. It doesn't make sense because there's a lot of externalities that come with that.
Yeah.
But the flip side is that the more and more you look like you're tightening the grip, the more and more you get this issue where it's like, okay, well, I don't want to lose money anymore.
Yeah.
I do see an avenue upon which I can walk and actually generate more revenue to offset this loss. And I know the flow is there. But if I can't do it from a local regulatory standpoint, then maybe it's time to walk. And when you walk and your neighbor finds out why you walked, they might start walking, and that can really start the sort of assessment tumble downhill, and then a lot of concern in the valley about the stability of prices. And not so much of great prices, but of the land retaining its value.
It's a run on it. But look, I think your point, John, about regulation is well taken, and we've argued it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's also predictable, right? So I would say, hey, I disagree with it, but our vendors have known that. And at what point do you want to do something about it versus just bitch to the electeds, right? So, but one of the things I want to kind of continue with what you were going is these points of influence, right? And like with finance, one of the things that I heard, Rob, and I'd love your take on it, is banks were changing kind of criteria along the way. Like they were lending on inventory. So that allowed a winery to say, okay, I can weather the storm. I can do this. They were lending on XYZ. That changed, right? And I don't think the public understands, like a winery, you have to have payroll, you have to buy barrels, you have to buy glass, and you have to pay your grape growers, hopefully, right? And then you have to go sell your wine in a year or 2 or 3.
Mm-hmm.
You need banks, you need cash flow, you need lending. What role does the financial sector have on this? And some of the challenges with some of these banks have gone under, maybe, because I know you have that perspective. So what has that done to the industry?
That's a great question. I think it's changed the nature of how wineries inventory, the way that they plan the use of inventory and how much they're willing to stack up. One of the biggest stories I've heard, which is really an eye-opener for me, is how large the inventory is between bulk juice and bottled wine. And the economics are really about the dynamic of those two worlds, which then bleeds back on how much risk am I taking as a lender if I go into that world thinking that, okay, well, I'm basically lending on the current value of your inventory with the idea that when the cash flows, it's going to pay me back. Yeah. But if that inventory is stuck in the supply chain and I don't see a really good way it's going to make its way out at the original value that I thought it was worth, that's going to change the way I look at the industry as a lender. And that could change kind of how deals get financed, not so much now, but 5 or 10 years down the line. So then one of the puzzles to solve in all this is, if that's true, then how do we clear the queue? Right? Is it going to be that there's just going to be like everybody says, okay, we're going to do one mass sell-off and figure out where it needs to go globally and just clear it out at one shot, and just everybody's just going to take a loss, because not everybody will make that economic decision. But if you don't do that, at some point you're going to face an inability to use the juice, or a lingering bottled wine inventory that that the longer and longer it sits, how much for example, when I buy wine, I like to buy older vintages, but I also like to know how they've been stored. Right. So, and after 4 or 5 years, if it hasn't kind of moved to another point in the supply chain, I don't know how it's being stored. Right.
But to your point though, so you play that forward, that vintner that's feeling the pressures of inventory or downgrading inventory, how that manifests to a grower is like, hey, I'm going to hold you to your cap. I can't take more grapes anymore because I have a bottleneck over here. Right? So that's what I've seen that's happening real time. So I like what you're saying is, I think you got to get rid of some of the excess, because the banks are recognizing, and I get that. That's smart, by the way. Like, I think that's healthy, but it creates tension and stress in the moment.
Well, and what we don't know is where it will go, right? Because if there's not, this is, I think, when I heard this, it's just like, oh, wow, okay, that seems like that is the core issue. That if I can't figure out how I'm going to liquidate, maybe, let's just say for sake of argument, the current inventory is double what it's supposed to be. Okay. So how do I take double what I normally am thinking about with respect to how I have my supply chain set up? What's that mean for my supply chain partners in terms of delivering to me? If I'm going to hold back, where will they go, and how stable will they remain? Corks, capsules, printing, glass, boxes, trucking, storage, you name it. And how does that bleed back down the supply chain to then the farmer decision to remain with the current acreage? And that's what a lot of you are seeing. So when I speak to groups, the first thing out of my mouth is, one of the toughest things for Napa Valley is that the last thing I want to see is balled up infrastructure ready to get burned. But that also tells a story about, on the margin, people are making those decisions to just take the rootstock and turn it into a ball to put some gas on and let it rip.
It was amazing.
It's just crazy.
Just a couple of days before we're recording this podcast, Jerry and I drove through Sonoma County. I have never seen the acreage, rolling hills that are fallow. Not even, they've been completely, made bald. They're not preserving vines. They're not preserving the infrastructure, irrigation. It's all gone. Now, some of that may have been grazing land, but most of it,
or aged vineyards,
but it doesn't look like they've left any infrastructure in place. So that's a longer term than just waiting to replant.
But to your point though, John, a lot of what I heard happen is there was stuff that was already aging, right? That was hitting that 20 to 30 year cycle. COVID happened. We all drank more because we were home, and then fires happened. So there was still enough demand, but it was delayed, right? The under issues were already there, but it was being masked by all these outside forces. Now you're seeing it like in Napa, right? You drive down, I've heard 3,000 acres have been pulled, or maybe more.
More than that, yeah.
I think we're going to find out what that does to the supply demand.
Well, it was also interesting with COVID, like you were just talking about, consumption went up, just kind of generally. After our 2020 fires that impacted so many people, all of a sudden people were worried in that moment, we've lost the whole vintage. Now what? Well, immediately there's oversupply in the next 5 years. So something more than natural occurrences has to happen to kind of reset. What is your vision? Are you seeing, because you're identifying a lot of the trouble spots, do you have ideas of how to start mitigating some of those? Like excessive inventory makes it harder to get loans because you're not being, you're a higher risk than you used to be. What do you do about that? I mean, I've seen a lot more online directly from wineries or through the, cellar trackers and the Vivinos and last bottles of the world, where all of a sudden multiple emails a day with some library aged stuff.
Inventory blowout.
So that, and you're like, wait a minute, what happened to that? Well, there's too much of it. So are you seeing there's some like emerging avenues where people are trying to get that out in the market? You've talked repeatedly, Alfredo, about friends that are spending weeks, if not longer, on the road now, doing that direct to consumer vintner dinners and events and all that, bringing the product to the people. So are those some of the things that you were saying, like, yeah, that makes sense, and then there are other things too?
Well, kind of going back to what we talked about earlier on the policy side, I think you're going to see some intriguing pieces of entrepreneurship inside the wineries in terms of doing things that maybe you're not quite zoned for, but you're going to start slowly doing them as a way of sort of differentiating yourself in the marketplace and moving inventory.
I don't know if that's what's going on in Sonoma County.
Well, anyway, so but you know what I mean? In the sense, I think you're going to see people get really creative in how to move inventory and still try to retain the profitability of it. Where, on that farther side, WTSO, last bottle, you're really seeing the movement of now we've got to move it out of inventory at high speed.
Yeah.
Right. But always, this is what's so fascinating about this industry, especially because it's all sitting in like 125-mile radius in a lot of ways, as an example of the global industry, is how much yield management, the retention of rootstock, what you're going to do. Are you going to put in new varietals? Are you going to think about the level of alcohol in the wine? How all that's then going to lead to maybe a changed bottled product, which will then change the marketing, which then will change the market, which might change who comes to your winery and then who ultimately comes to Napa. And so that's what's so fascinating to me. But that's the beauty is I don't have a deep investment in the industry right now. So it's I'm not staying up all night trying to think about how I'm going to get these things pruned and then have to pay for next year. But that there's a lot of dynamics that, to watch almost on this like weird, discrete annual basis, that when these decisions are made, it's telling a story, not now, but actually what's going to happen 2 or 3 years from now.
Look, you're totally right. And I can just tell you, luckily we have someone that buys the grapes so I can sleep at night most days. But the hard part though, right, is the cost of doing business in Napa. Set aside the land costs for a second, your labor costs, right? Everything else, you're coming in at a landed product that's already high for cab, right? So I just don't know how you can pivot, right? On the grower side, I think what you're hitting on is, I think I've said this differentiation word for a long time. They're going to have to find a way to differentiate themselves at the end of the spectrum, which is at the vintner destination, winery, dinners, and all that. That's where it is, because there's not a lot of wiggle room here at the end of the day, right? Because we're all paying the same people the same rate. We're not getting labor from a hidden country at a hidden rate. It's all there, right? So when you factor that in, the Kubota tractor, whether you buy it or I buy it, it's the same tractor. So I just don't know how you can do that differently. So I think you're spot on that, right? That's what I was asking you about labor costs, because if it's all the same, I don't know how Sonoma County grows cab, right? And have a profitability to do so, right?
It might be pure scale. It could be. But it could be that 5 years from now, the amount of cab coming out of Sonoma County will be, a quantum change down, because it won't be profitable anymore and there'll be a change. It's very hard to know. You think that Sonoma County will probably retain as much of the Pinot as it can, because the niche is kind of built, analogous to kind of Napa cab.
Weather pattern,
right?
all that. Cool.
Yeah. So all that seems, we haven't even talked about climate change and all what that might do, but that'll probably be, about the same time that we're all doing something else. But But at the end of the day, some folks are also thinking about that as yet another vector of change that's coming, and whether or not I should take this opportunity to start planning for that endpoint, right?
Well, there's talk about that already, that people say, oh, there's too much cab. Well, then plant something else. Well, it's not that simple.
It's not that simple.
And just like, Pinots and Zins that are so good in Sonoma County in particular, cab is a more challenging thing. You can do it over there in some areas, but just like Pinot isn't perfect in Napa Valley. And so it isn't something, or even a non-grape product, crop. Oh, just take out your vines and put some row crop in. Well, how are you supposed to do that, and how are the numbers supposed to work? Because you still have all the ag regulations, you have the labor costs and the health and safety costs, and it becomes even more impossible financially.
Well, it does in pencil, because I can tell you, like, everything's for sale today. Like, so we look at vineyard deals, it's like, there is no way to make money. And you tell that person, well, my property's worth this. I was like, I'm sorry.
Only if somebody pays that.
Because no bank's going to lend you money on that. But to your point though, John, there's people that planted Cab Franc and Carneros. There's no reason to plant Cab Franc Carneros. That needs to go out, right? There's people that are planting nice cab in Woodland Valley and thinking they were going to get Napa average. They shouldn't get Napa average. So I think there's going to be some market corrections, which I think is healthy. And I think what you said, Rob, about Sonoma having this, perception of Pinot, I think it's going to work. It's going to almost be like the free market at work a little bit, which is healthy, right? But let's talk about threats, because you mentioned climate change. And John and I, we created the Climate Action Committee. You should be proud of that, John.
Yes, we did. But, others have tried to take credit for it, but the two of us and our former colleague, Chris Canning.
But threats, so like, what are some of the threats you see out there, though, Rob, that are coming our way? Because I do think climate change, I can tell you, it's changing. It's hotter in certain parts, right?
Yeah, I think on sort of existential threat, climate change and a demographic shift away from alcohol, not just wine, I think you can kind of say are kind of 10,000 foot looming specters that are going to move on with us for some time to come. In the short term, I think that there's going to be the two major threats to me are, one is to rest on laurels, in that I think people will not run away from wine in the short to medium term. So, but what they'll do is they'll rethink the way that they spend on wine. That's my take. And so the biggest threat is if you just sort of like keep trucking along in the way you used to do business and assume everybody's going to come back, you're forgetting that there's a huge competitive element running parallel to you, inclusive of Washington, Oregon, international, and Sonoma. If you're just thinking Napa, as the centerpiece of it. It's not like everybody's going to stop in their tracks and not be thinking all exactly the same thing. How do we draw people in? How do we try to maximize profit? How do we try to blow out inventory in such a way that we don't undermine brand? How do we, really kind of balance all that to where if we feel like that the storm is going to go by us in 3 or 4 years, we're actually ready to accelerate when the time comes. So I think some of the threat is kind of very parochial sort of thinking where, this is never going to change for me. It's just, just got to ride it out. So I'm not going to do anything different. In 5 years, everybody's going to want to come back, right? You're forgetting that competitive threat is marching alongside of you and everybody's kind of feeling the same thing. So that to me is number one. Number two is just, is not having a real feel of what Napa has become. I think the thing about Napa is that it's branded. Napa Valley Vineyards done an amazing job of pushing the Napa Valley brand global, as well as, a lot of the wineries here in the Valley have done. Doubling down on how you can prepare for change over time. People might want to come here for reasons that maybe have nothing to do with wine. It might be might be time to reorient that sort of slow looming threat of people who don't want to keep going up valley once they're in the city of Napa, thinking more up valley, right? That's where the wine industry really lives in Napa County, in my mind. But if in the city of Napa is going to be a gateway, the next threat is not thinking of a long-term up and down valley strategy in such a way that when the change comes, if you haven't closed off the bottom, the top's ready to receive them.
That's exactly what I was going to bring up. And I'll say it a little bit differently about the layers of activity and interests that can be satisfied by coming to the Napa Valley. Not every destination has multiple layers of the restaurant food experience, the wine experience, the hiking, biking trails, the natural environment that people come here and enjoy, the weather. We've become a live music destination. There are other things that are happening. They sometimes butt up against the restrictions. And so that's where I know a lot of us have been talking about having some more reasonableness and flexibility in regulation to allow creativity to then also be attracting different audiences that have hesitated to come. Take advantage of the fact, we've talked in previous podcasts about why is the idea of having weddings hosted at wineries such a negative, and it has been for decades. It's the thing that people say, oh, you can't even talk about that. Well, why not? Because
but that's the hunkering down, John.
Right.
That's that mentality.
It's always been this way. Well, but as we've said recently on podcasts, you get brand loyalty when you bring, guests and families to an event that they then celebrate every year for the rest of their lives. There is a connection to, farming, agriculture, wine in doing that. When you have music events, amplified music, oh my gosh, that's, the sky's going to fall. Amplified music, where you get to sit out like a Live in the Vineyard experience. We have such an amazing canvas here in this valley. So I think there needs to be some more flexibility and, like I said, reasonableness to allow this evolution, because the industry cannot survive the same way it did 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And meanwhile, everyone seems to agree the ag preserve is worth protecting, but it is also putting a lot of that pressure on keeping things exactly the way they have been for a long time.
I want to be controversial for a second, John.
Really?
Yeah, because I'll tell you, I was looking at a little property off Orchard Avenue. It was a vineyard, and there was residential housing on the south of it. And you ran the numbers, and I think I talked about it, John, in the previous pod. I was like, this makes no sense to be a vineyard. Right? It makes sense to be divided up into 12 or 20 single family home lots. And I think the ag preserve will be on the table someday. That's just my opinion, because you have some land that I would call C average, D average land for grapes that could be better served for residential homes. Now, and it's going to lead to my next question, Rob, because Napa's, in my opinion, we're grappling with what type of wine region do we want to be when we grow up? And are we trending towards the Bordeaux and the Burgundy, or are we going to be more diverse and offer different selections? I just don't see how you could have, where you can try to be everything to everyone. And I don't know if we're willing to ask that question yet as a community, in that community. So when we're willing to say, Pote Valley, come on in. Pritchard Hill, come on in. Mount Veeder, come on in. Carneros, come on in. Just from your vantage point, where is Napa tracking, right? With all these forces, the regulations you mentioned, is it going to become more of an exclusive wine region? Or is it just going to be or is it going to maintain what it is today? And I don't know if that's a loaded question.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that at the end of the day, my take is that Napa is going to continue to be probably the prevalent American wine region as far as the eye can see. The trickiness is how far do you want to push that from accessibility to consumers? So, and this kind of comes full circle to one of your one of your earlier questions, which was, if you look at the costs, not so much of running the business, but of the consumer coming to Napa, how much of it do you want to do where it is just, it should rival what you're going to do at a really high-end coastal space, and layer on relatively high-cost wine, relatively high-cost tastings, relatively high-cost winemaker dinners. At some point, that model either has to say, this is where we're going to double down, and we think there's going to be a K-shaped economy as far as the eye can see, because the reasons why people spend here are maybe more equity market driven than they are income driven in terms of what I do every day. I figure I'm just going to, worst case, I'll just pay it off later, or mom and dad will pay it off or what have you. But I don't see the Valley being able to sustain itself on those kind of marginal decisions forever. There are going to be some wineries you're going to have to reckon with, well, how do I get more competitive? And it could be on price. It could be that hotels will end up having to change the way they do it as well. But the one beauty of what Napa has done, if there's anything, is branded itself in a global way where people are willing to pay for that experience. I mean, it's done. There are experiences here you can't have without, in my opinion, really traveling a very long distance. So if you got 6.5 million people in a 25-mile radius from Redwood City, that's a pretty good market to just grind on as far as you can, as long as the income is moving. So I think part of it is, from a defining Napa long-term standpoint, is what audience does Napa want to play to, not now, but 20 years from now? Yeah. Is it, because I think of my daughter who's almost 19, it's been kind of funny the last 12 months. She's slowly asking me about wine.
Love it.
Right. And I kind of wonder, okay, so she's been at college, and I wonder where is she getting that input from? Because, we're a wine household, and we have wine, regularly, not daily, but enough to where she's exposed to it. And it makes you kind of wonder, where she's getting that input. Now, the trick is how does the industry convert those kind of thoughts into revenue and action? Exactly.
But to your point though, so like, I agree with you, right? I think people will come online, but if we're trying to compete in this segment where it's affordable, easy to access, Paso can do that in spades. So, and I'm not being critical of them, Sonoma, Lodi, all these regions. Where's Napa's differentiation, right? And that's what I'm focused on, is there has to be a differentiation where if I'm going to pay X, there's derived value from paying more. And I think that's the question Napa has to really understand, is where's that value proposition?
So that's a great kind of, almost like rhetorical question. I know. Because in so many ways, Napa has differentiated itself almost by a mystique.
Correct.
By a story that gets told about what happens when you come here. So to your point, right, you can go to Paso, or you can go to Lodi, you can go to Monterey, you can go, even to Sonoma. There's amazing opportunities, amazing experiences. But Napa, for someone plucked from like St. Louis, Napa has this sort of like pop that
on day one,
and it's really almost like the differentiation back in the day of how Nike existed in the world of athletic footwear, and there was just a space because the demand was there. It just Napa is like the swoosh.
But they protected that space,
right? So, and that's why I said earlier that one of the major threats in my mind is that if that no longer works for a generation who's more money conscious and more thinking about that they want to spread their consumption across a broader palette of goods and services, will Oregon start to look better to them? Will Monterey, will parts of Sonoma look on the margin? Folks that would have come to Napa, will they change? That's where Napa's got to really think about, okay, if we've kind of rode this baby boomer wave for a long time. If that wave is cresting and naturally going to, ebb, if the flow now is somebody like my daughter, how do we capture that person for the next 25 years? I mean, like I said, it's a very like intellectually stimulating, but tough question to answer.
But I wish more people had that.
I'll share a quick anecdote that I just heard from a longtime high-profile vintner who owns a tasting room downtown Napa. Mm-hmm. He was at the tasting room, and 5 young women and 2 older women came into the tasting room. So he went over to greet them. And apparently it was obvious that one of them was having a 21st birthday. So he went over, a celebration. Yeah. And like, where are you from? Iowa.
Yeah.
And he said, well, why are you here? It's like, and the birthday gal's like, I've always wanted to come to Napa Valley to have wine. So I wanted all my girlfriends to come with me, and they did. Mm-hmm. And so he said, well, we're hearing all in the media that your generation doesn't drink wine anymore. And they're like, no, we love wine. And so part of it is the perception.
Yeah.
It is for every positive story about the wine industry, there are 15 negative ones that all say the same thing, which is
it's one reporter, John. We know it is.
Well, but even from other parts of the country, there's an opportunity to knock down the brand of Napa and just keep saying it's too expensive for you. Don't bother. Mm-hmm. But there is still that mystique that you were just talking about. We collectively as Napa Valley need to shift how to reach that demographic, because it is a different demographic, but the brand and the quality is still there. So you have to figure out how to market differently.
What you said, John, about quality, though, I think that's critical, right? Because Napa County, and I think it was Bill Dodd and Rex that started the Great Wine, that joined the Great Wine Capitals, which is, I think, the 12 wine regions throughout the world. And we would get together once a year. And in that, that was my first time understanding what Napa was on a global scale. When you go and you're from Napa, right? It's that instant reaction of quality, premiumness. And some of them have never touched it, seen it, but they have it. You can't put value on that, right? But it's how do you protect that? Right. And to me, it's vintners going on the road and creating these experiences. But it's when people come here, you have to deliver on it too. What's different is we have incredible hotels and the food scene on Napa has come online. Right. So I'm optimistic. I still think people are drinking. And I think was it Robert Mondavi that said, wine is not meant to be had every day unless you want it to have every day. All right. So
it's a cultural drink.
It's a social drink. You and I cannot go have tequila every day because it's 40% alcohol, right? And we would not be productive. We can have a glass of wine and still be productive. So I think wine is tethered into a lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And especially in some of these emerging communities and countries, right? I still think wine is going to have a place in those communities, right? And I think the vintners are doing some great stuff of going out there, and others are too. But I got a question around private equity. Because you've seen private equity kind of come into Napa a little bit more. And I'm just concerned, right? And I think private equity is good because they'll come in and buy people out. Yep. But private equity has to make money too. What's your take? Or maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But what's your take on private equity's role in acquisitions and owning brands and vineyards? And it's not just Napa, it's happening.
Oh, sure. I think you're going to see more of it. I mean, as you see the industry consolidate, if the hot money is there, it'll come through that mechanism. Yeah. To the idea that it needs to make money, I think, again, it's very important that we're never going to figure this out data-wise very strongly, but I think it's still very good to think about in your mind. Where does this lie in the portfolio of the private equity's assets in such a way that this one subclass has got to make profit versus the other ones? So the private equity might purely be looking for diversification, crown jewel, new industry, and not so much just the diversification of what it is, but you're actually thinking about better sort of placement asset wise in terms of industry exposure. Yeah. You have no idea, right? So, and you're never going to be able to do a survey of all the ownership to say, hey, why are you here? And so I think that and you kind of alluded to the earlier too, when you think about sort of the market mechanism, it is very tough to keep private equity out, right? So I've had a lot of conversations with city and county elected officials about, well, how do we keep people from buying second properties and reduce the amount of rental properties that are on the open market? I said, well, then just stop it from being sold. Because if you say it's going up for sale, how are you really going to filter the market? And won't the seller go absolutely ballistic if you did that? And then so part of it also is that, this is the way the market works. If you don't like it, what you do is you regulate. But there's also an opportunity cost to the level of regulation. So the private equity, to me, I think will act as somewhat of a cleansing agent of some of this in the medium term. It probably will, especially as long as the equity market is still showing gains and people are thinking about portfolio plays. Yeah. On the broader concern is whether or not that turns into more private credit deals, which might lead to a little bit more risk exposure. But that's a whole other subject. We could have done the whole day today on private equity versus private capital, or private credit. But anyway, but bottom line is I think you'll see more of it come into the Valley just naturally as a cleansing agent of what's going on.
Look, I don't think it's bad. Sorry to interrupt, John. I think it's healthy that it comes in. And I think you're right, though, right? It's hard to understand what the mix of allocation is. Because some may say, hey, look, we're making money on this side. It's upward appreciation or projections. But it allows for an exit for someone that does need to exit, right? And that's healthy.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't think you should shy away from it, but I think a lot of the perception is people are just scared of the unknown. And once you get that in front, once you put fear in electeds, it's like, oh, let's.
There's also, I think, a fear of having absentee ownership in such a way that you're losing that sort of local farmer feel, which, to a certain extent, as hardcore as this may sound, you kind of have to get over. Because it's the nature, if you want the market mechanism to work this direction, this is the penalty the market mechanism work in the other one.
Yeah.
Think about the only thing that's clear after this really interesting and in-depth conversation is how complicated it is. Yeah. And as soon as you try to go a certain direction to solve 1, 2, or 5 or 10 issues, then 1, 2, or 5 more pop up. And,
which is awesome.
And so it's not an easy course correction, and it's complicated, but at least we get to enjoy our Napa Valley.
Are you saying
There we go.
we're wrapping up, John?
We are wrapping up.
Gosh, I was barely getting started.
Caleb's battery's about to run out. So,
Editor's note. In fact, the battery was not going to run out.
Well, thanks guys for having me.
thank you so much.
Appreciate
and,
it.
Cheers.
Looking forward to enjoying this.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank
bet.
you.
Cheers.
Chin
Go Seawolves.
Alfredo, I know you were kind of in your wheelhouse today, talking to Rob about finance and equity. So I'm really curious to hear your thoughts.
You know I'm giddy because it was an intellectual conversation and it was exciting. You had someone that knows his shit, right? He's not an intellect that speaks in ways that we can't understand. Those are real conversations, right? And I think, some of the topics we got into, these are the things that should not be happening on a podcast only, John. I really hope, and it's actually a challenge, our elected leaders should be having that conversation. Our wonderful trade groups should be having these conversations. And yet, and maybe I'm wrong, John, you're more tied in with these industry groups. Are people having these conversations?
I think there is I'll call it, maybe this is not fair, a superficial recognition and analysis of what's happening. When you have somebody like Rob that has so much deep knowledge of all the different aspects of it, which is why I was commenting at the end about how complex this is, because as soon as you shift one thing, that shifts so many other things. And it isn't just straight up about the cost of Napa.
Yeah.
It's not just the cost of wine. There's so many different factors.
But it's okay to say, look, it's not 1 + 1. This equation's a little bit more complicated, John. It's 1+ with an X and a Y and a Z, and a decimal, right? But then let's talk about it. And to me, I said things that probably are controversial. The ag preserve can be in jeopardy. Well, then let's talk about how we should protect it, right? Or let's talk about how we allow ag to be profitable, because it has to be profitable. Or let's talk about the role of how finance and loans and lending works. But it's almost like we're not willing to talk about that. And I think that's a huge disservice to the county and to the generation that's going to inherit this place from us.
But when we are recording this, the county is, at all the jurisdictions are going through their budgets and they're having their deep dives. I do hope that during these processes, there is a recognition, especially with the 2-year budgets that they're projecting. There's a recognition that, money, especially taxes, are going to be declining for at least the next several years because of property values, because of sales tax decreases. And so they need to be making decisions based on not just today, but what's going to happen over the next several years.
Well, John, it's a fact. Property tax, sales tax, and TOT, the core revenues for the county of Napa, they're declining. Since I've been studying budget, call it 15 years, I've never seen that happen. And 55% of the employee, revenue or the employee expenses are employee wages and benefits. We should pay people. The kind of people the staff deserve it. But when 55% of your expenses are fixed and your revenues are declining, that's not a white flag. That's a red flag. But I don't think they're going to do anything about it, John. Because government, we work in instant moments. So okay, we're going to tap into reserves, so you get a pass. Where I really want to land this on is, I think the industry groups and leaders have to acknowledge that their world has changed. The industry has changed. Wine has changed. But we talked about the perception of value add, John, and how that is what gets Napa a bump on day one. I don't know if the industry groups, and I'll give them credit, they just raised $6 million. But I want to know, besides the white paper, that's still there, and I haven't seen meaningful action, what are they doing to meet the moment?
I think the urgency is still in question. We know that the urgency exists now. I hope government can react as quickly as it needs to recognize there's some things that can be changed, but it's not going to be one thing fixes it. And this is also, all economic projections that I've heard are this is a multi-year situation. Some think it might be the bottom in terms of the financial impacts, but we don't know what's going to happen with tariffs. We don't know what's going to happen with any other influences. And I worry most about the smaller, either the family farms or the smaller wineries that just don't have the resources to weather the multi-year impacts.
Look, and I get why you say you worry about the family farms and the small people. I worry about the big boys and girls just as much, John, because they're an anchor, right? They're out there moving the industry, the brand, putting us in new markets. You need both.
Sure.
Right? And I think Napa is not recognizing that. So if you don't, things like the Ag Preserve will be in jeopardy, right? Everything we've cherished will go by the wayside, not by the way, it will be threatened. So at some point, the industry leaders have to step up. So like this is a direct challenge to the vintners, the grape growers, the farm bureau, the wine growers. What do you want to do?
And we've seen in Sonoma County, their Board of Supervisors just recently adopted a new action plan that supports changes to agriculture. And that's what we've been working on here in Napa County. I do hope all stakeholders, and it's not just the wine industry, it's all stakeholders in Napa Valley need to be aware of the realities. It's not an easy fix. There's not a lot of profitability that's, if the wine industry just loses a little bit of money, if that's how people perceive this, they're wrong. It's a bigger deal than that.
I agree, but I also don't want to hear that we're going to solve it through the general plan, or when you say, other people, John, you're not always going to have consensus. You're going to leave some people off the island. But guess what? We may not have an island to be on, right? By wanting consensus. So yes, weddings might be controversial. Doing an experience in the vineyard might be controversial, but it's worth it if it protects what we have.
I agree. And I do think that more and more people understand the seriousness of the situation. I mean, it's not the sky is falling, but status quo is not going to be good enough.
All right, well, let's drink wine to help, John.
We're doing our best. Cheers.